Right now, if someone close to you dies, you probably know exactly what to do. There's a funeral. There's a set number of days you're expected to take off work. There's a script for what to say, what to wear, how long is too long to be visibly sad. But that entire structure, the one that makes grief feel so orderly, is nowhere near as old as you'd think. The real reason has less to do with sadness than you'd expect, and a lot more to do with logistics. Because for most of human history, the hardest part of losing someone wasn't feeling the loss. It was figuring out what to physically do about it. You'd assume grief has always looked roughly the same: a body, a burial, some tears, some time. It feels like the most basic human ritual there is. But go back far enough, and the picture gets stranger and a lot more practical than you'd expect. Start with the body itself. Today, when someone dies, you call a number. Professionals come. There's a system. For the vast majority of human history, there was no system. There was just you, the corpse, and a problem that needed solving within hours, not days. In hot climates, decomposition starts fast. Early human groups, hunter-gatherers moving in small bands of maybe 20 to 50 people, didn't have the luxury of a slow, reflective mourning period before dealing with the body. Archaeological evidence from sites like Kafsa Cave in modern-day Israel, where remains dating back roughly 100,000 years show deliberate burial with red ochre pigment, suggests that even Paleolithic humans treated the dead with intention. But intention and sentimentality aren't the same thing. That ochre wasn't necessarily about honoring a life. Some anthropologists argue it may have served a more practical function, marking the body, sealing it, treating it almost like a hazard that needed containment. Here's the part that tends to surprise people. In many nomadic societies, elaborate mourning simply wasn't affordable. If your group needs to move to follow migrating animals or ripening plants, you cannot spend 2 weeks sitting with a body. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups, like the Hadza of Tanzania, who live in a way that likely resembles ancient human patterns more closely than agricultural societies do, show death handled with startling speed. A person dies, the group grieves intensely but briefly, and then life resumes almost immediately, because it has to. There isn't a version of the schedule where everyone gets a week off. That's the ancient reality underneath the modern assumption. You'd think grief has always come with permission to slow down. For most of human existence, it came with the opposite. You grieved while walking. You grieved while foraging. You grieved with your hands full, because the group's survival didn't pause for anyone's, including yours. So what changed? The turning point wasn't really about emotion evolving. It was about settlement. Once humans began staying in one place, starting roughly 12,000 years ago, with the rise of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent, death stopped being a problem you solved and moved past. It became something you could build a relationship with. If you're not migrating next week, you can dig a proper grave. You can mark it. You can come back to it. Cemeteries, as fixed, revisitable places, only make sense once humans stop moving. This is when grief starts to look more like what you'd recognize today. Something with duration, something with return visits, something with a place attached to it. And once grief had a place, it started getting rules. Ancient Egyptian mourning practices, which developed over thousands of years, starting around 3000 BCE, are a good example of just how procedural death became once societies had the resources to formalize it. Professional mourners were hired. Wailing women, sometimes called kites for their high, keening cries, would perform grief publicly as part of the funeral procession, regardless of whether they had any personal connection to the deceased. This wasn't seen as fake. It was seen as necessary. The dead needed a proper send-off, and a proper send-off required volume, spectacle, and a workforce, because a correct amount of visible sorrow was now a social obligation, not just a private feeling. Here's the surprising detail that tends to catch people off guard. In a lot of ancient and even some traditional societies today, grief wasn't just tolerated when expressed loudly. It was mandatory. Ancient Roman funerals for wealthy families sometimes included praefectae, professional mourning women paid specifically to cry, tear their hair, and lament loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. If you didn't hire enough of them, or if your family's grief looked too quiet, that silence could be read as disrespect toward the dead, or worse, suspicion that you weren't sad enough to have actually loved them. Compare that to the modern expectation, where restrained, composed grief is often treated as the mature, respectable version, and you start to see how much of what feels like a universal human instinct is actually a set of cultural stage directions that have simply flipped over time. Victorian England took this even further, turning grief into something closer to a wardrobe requirement. Widows were expected to wear black mourning attire for up to 2 years, moving through defined stages, full mourning, then half mourning, with specific fabrics and even specific shades of gray and lavender, signaling exactly how far along in the grieving process a person was supposed to be. You could look at a stranger's clothing on a London street in 1870 and know, down to the month, roughly how long ago they'd lost someone. Grief had become legible. It had a uniform. It's worth pausing on how different this is from what came before it. For tens of thousands of years, humans grieved on the move, briefly and functionally, because survival demanded it. Then, once humans settled down, grief slowly turned into performance, then procedure, then fashion. None of these versions is more real than the others. They're just different solutions to the same underlying problem. What do you do with a feeling that doesn't have an obvious off switch, in a body that has to keep functioning anyway? Modern grief research actually circles back to something the earliest humans seem to understand instinctively. Psychologists studying bereavement in the 20th century, notably through the work built on Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stage model in the 1960s, initially proposed that grief moved through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance in something like a fixed order. Later research pushed back hard on this, showing that grief is far messier and more individual than any tidy staircase of stages. In a way, that messiness is closer to how a Hadza forager or a Paleolithic band member likely experienced loss, not as a clean, structured process, but as something that happened while everything else kept happening too. There's also a strange twist in how modern, industrialized cultures handle death compared to almost everyone who came before us. You are, statistically, far less likely than your ancestors to have witnessed a death up close. For most of human history, dying happened at home, in front of family, often multiple times within a single childhood given how common early death was. Today, most people in wealthy countries die in hospitals, out of view, handled by professionals you'll likely never meet. You've built an entire system specifically designed to keep you from having to do what every single one of your ancestors did constantly: sit with a body and figure out what comes next. In a sense, you've outsourced the most ancient human task there is. So the 3-day bereavement policy at your job, the black clothing, the expectation that you'll be back to normal within a socially acceptable window, none of that is some deep evolutionary instinct. It's a patchwork of habits borrowed from Victorian fashion, Roman performance, Egyptian procedure, and a deeply practical hunter-gatherer need to keep moving, all stitched together into something that feels timeless, mostly because nobody ever questions it. So next time you find yourself wondering whether you're grieving the right way, remember that there hasn't actually been a right way for most of human history. There's only ever been whatever your particular ancestors could afford to do, given the climate, the schedule, and how far they needed to walk by morning.